Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with Mike Mason and we talked about the different Call of Cthulhu settings. So things like Gaslight, Down Darker Trails, Berlin, 1920s versus modern day, things like that. I was interested in hearing what was different about playing in these settings, writing for these settings, and what Mike's opinion on these settings were in general. I started off the interview by asking him just to give a list of all the Call of Cthulhu settings out there. So I'm going to jump across to the interview now, but first, remember to subscribe to our channel. It really helps us out and it lets us make more videos like this. Thank you.
The beauty of Call of Cthulhu is it can take place at any point in history, even history that's not happened yet, like in the far future. It's great because it's kind of modeled on the real world. So it's very easy to drop Call of Cthulhu into any time period. But as you know, the core setting for Call of Cthulhu has always been the kind of the roaring 1920s into the 1930s, kind of, that kind of grand period between the end of the Great War and the beginning of the Second World War. That kind of strange kind of bookmark period of history. The other core period really is the modern day, now, because if you pick up the Keeper rule book, there are rules and details for characters and equipment from the 1920s and the modern day. So in a sense, if you want to play either of those kind of settings, the core rulebook kind of gives you what you need. But as I say, why limit yourself to those kind of areas? So Call of Cthulhu has got a few kind of what you'd say are kind of key settings, particularly Cthulhu by Gaslight, which is what you would call the kind of Victorian England, the kind of fog-shrouded alleys of the latter 1800s period. And that kind of, it's kind of centered on London because it's that kind of classic kind of, fog-shrouded street vibe. However, it does kind of roll out into the green and pleasant lands of England and into Europe, and so on. And that's, if you're into Sherlock Holmes and all of that kind of stuff, that's the thing. A kind of sister to Gaslight is actually Down Darker Trails, because it's set in the American Old West, but takes place around the same time as Gaslight does. It's just in a completely different part of the world. So one of the things we're going to be doing with the new edition of Gaslight, that's obviously coming down the road, is whilst, yes, it will be focused on London and England and so forth, we are going to kind of, we are going to sort of pay a nod and look to the east coast of the USA as well, because that kind of fits into that Gaslight model. And then once you leave the east coast and head west, you suddenly find yourself transformed into Down Darker Trails. So in a sense, they are all one setting, but we have two two modes of looking at it in that way. So they fit very nicely together in that way. The other interesting settings are, there's Cthulhu Dark Ages, which is set around the turn of the 1000 AD, just before, just after, depending on where you want to play it. So that's kind of post-Roman Britain, where there's bits and pieces of the old Roman Empire still knocking around, bits in there, but basically they're long gone, and the folk in England are trying to make the best of it. But the Vikings are all going, oh, you've got lots of land and things we want, and they're coming in to pillage and take land and so forth. You've got that all going on, and you got the old kind of the old ways versus the new ways of Christianity and all that sort of thing kicking off as well. So it's a really interesting kind of time period for that. The other one, which isn't, I guess, technically it's a setting, but it's one of them weird ones. You have the Dreamlands, which is kind of takes place whenever you want it to. It's kind of a strange kind of place. It could be modernish, it could be oldish, but it's this dream landscape that's beyond reality. It's another dimension, effectively. That's kind of a setting as well, and it's a setting that again we'll be coming back to with a new edition down the road. But those are the kind of the core settings. I'm just racking my brain in case I've missed the obvious one. back in the day, Chaosium did a couple of books called Strange Eons. I think it was Strange Eons and Strange Eons 2. And they were basically different Call of Cthulhu scenarios in very different time periods. And the one that I remember particularly is the one that's sort of set in prehistoric times, where you effectively playing kind of, prehistoric humans, cavemen and women and so forth, dinosaurs and all that kind of thing, dealing with a mystery. And that brings its own challenges. And obviously, how do you use library use in the prehistoric? Well, you don't, but that kind of thing. And those two books kind of had lots of different kind of cool ideas for doing different things in a slightly different way. We're about to release Regency Cthulhu, which is a whole new setting, really. It's a bit, when I say it's a whole new setting, it's really just one book. It's a bit like Reign of Terror, which is another setting I didn't mention, which is the one set during the French Revolution, during the Terror, and is particularly obviously focused on Paris, but can roll out into the rest of France. That's a two-part mini campaign, effectively, that can be played as a one-off, or can link into the larger campaign of Horror on the Orient Express. And that's really cool. You're playing people in a political time where it's a kind of mirrors the kind of the paranoia of the 1950s to some degree, where who can you trust, who's an informant, who's pro-revolution, who's anti-revolution. You're caught in the crossfire, and you've got the mythos as well trying to mess things up as well. And so Regency Cthulhu is very similar to that. It takes place in the very early 1800s, during what is known as the British Regency, when King George went mad, and his son became the Prince Regent, and effectively ruled for a period while his father couldn't, basically. And so this is very much, in a word, Jane Austen. So if you've seen any Jane Austen films or read the books or whatever, it's that period where it's all very, high society and coaches and manor houses and balls and whatnot. And Regency Cthulhu is basically, again, a two-part or two connected scenarios, semi-connected, that form a mini campaign in that period. And they're really cool scenarios, and allows you to kind of play as with any other kind of Call of Cthulhu. So it allows you to play Call of Cthulhu the same way, but just a little bit different. You get a different kind of feel for it. The character agendas are slightly different. And there's a whole kind of social kind of etiquette that's quite different. Playing characters in the Old West, the social etiquette is very different to playing them in Gaslight Victorian London. It's very different to playing 1920s gangsters and flappers. It's very different to playing average people in the modern day dealing with the mythos. They all come at it in a slightly different way, because society is slightly different, because of, that's how history works. People were different back in, 100 years ago, and even more, 200 years or plus. So it's kind of, enjoying the story that kind of different epoch, period of history kind of presents for you, really.
There's so many eras out there, and I know that everybody has their favorite. Everybody has one that they want to play in, and which one they're going to enjoy the most is so dependent on their GM and which stories they play and who they are and what they're interested in, everything like that. I want to ask, from a writing perspective, you as an editor, as a writer of scenarios, which is the hardest setting for you to work in?
It's really down to personal. There's not one that would be generically harder than any other. It comes down to your personal knowledge or area of interest, to be frank. I have not a great deal of interest in the Regency era. It's not my thing, but Lynn Hardy, who did the development work on that particular book, has got a very big interest in that area. So naturally, she was a very much more of a natural fit than I was. I would find that quite difficult, because I have to do primary research for that. I don't know it already. I don't know necessarily all of the social kind of mores, all the kind of technical stuff that was going on in that early kind of 1800 period. Whereas a lot of that Lynn just knows off the top of her head, and obviously can just back that up with some more research, where I have to do more research to that. Whereas Gaslight, Victorian, I know that much better because that's a thing I've always been interested in. I've always enjoyed reading the Sherlock Holmes stories and the kind of, I've watched many films in that era kind of thing. So I feel I've got a good bedding of information and knowledge. And also, I live in England where it's set. So I got by osmosis, I know a little bit about it anyway. It's not completely alien to me. So I'm more familiar with that. So that's easier for me to do. But any time periods that you're doing, it comes down to research and how easy it is to get that information. Because as you can imagine, getting information on 980 AD during the Dark Ages is pretty hard, because it's called the Dark Ages for a reason, because there's nothing about, we know very little about it. So trying to write a book about the Dark Ages is a tough ask if you know nothing, if you've got no background in that. So when we put it together, we work with people who have got history degrees and who have studied that period and know some stuff about it. So again, they're a better fit for that kind of information than necessarily I would be. What I can do is come in and fact check. I can do my own reading on the subject and think, I think we're missing something about, I don't know, how houses were built. I'll go and research that one bit, and so I can plug that gap if needs be. Just for a very inane example. But I enjoy doing gaslight scenarios because that's what I love. I like 1920s too, and the 30s, and I like modern day. And it's really hard to go which one is better, because I like them all. But they're the ones personally I find easier to do, because I've spent nearly 40 odd years playing the game and reading stuff about this stuff. I've been reading books around the 1920s and 30s for like 40 years, history books. So I guess I know a little bit about it. So that's why it's easier for me to say those are, preferable for me to work on in that way.
Well, you've preempted my next question, which was going to be what's your personal favorite? And I think you've answered that really well. So let me ask you one last question before we finish up then. Cthulhu has a very distinct flavor, that cosmic horror, that sense of dread, that sense of excitement, that sense of exploration. Do you think that there is a setting that is the most exotic, that brings the most to the table, or is the biggest departure from the quote unquote standard Call of Cthulhu experience?
I think, I guess I would say something set during one of the world wars, because the setup is different. Whereas, you play a modern day, a 1920s, 30s, a Gaslight, even a Dark Ages kind of setup, you're kind of, you are being pulled into the mystery for whatever hook and reason it is, but you are nominally regular folk. You may be experts in certain areas, but you are, you're pulled together to deal with this thing, for whatever reason. Whereas in wartime, it's a different setup. You're being pulled in because you're already involved in some way. It's much easier to be told, right, you lot, I need you to go over there and do that because I'm an officer and you're under me. And so the actual motivation is completely different in a way, because your average soldier can't, refuse an order. So they're told to go and clear out this farmhouse or whatever. They can't, not do it. And if they get there and find that actually hidden beneath the farmhouse is a dungeon full of ghouls, and it's going to be a bit trickier than they thought, and they think, well, we don't want to get involved in this. Let's just walk away. They can't walk away because they've been told they've got to clear it out. And so I think that makes for a slightly different dynamic. And obviously, one of the things we are developing at the moment is the kind of darkest hour World War II material that Cubicle 7 originally released, and that we have now kind of taken on, and we'll be putting that back out. And so those kind of different kind of setups are going to come to the fore when we do that, because obviously there was a whole kind of premise of a kind of secret network within the Allied forces for dealing with the mythos, which is a very different kind of premise to the rest of Call of Cthulhu, because in that setup, obviously it means that the authorities, well, some part of the authorities understand, or at least have a knowledge of the mythos to some degree. Whereas in most Call of Cthulhu settings, that's not really on the table. It's, you know, it's not assumed that government knows about the mythos. You know, it's a you know, case by case basis.